Good morning, Seacrest. How are you? Welcome back to Hi There with Rabbi Leah. And this may look like familiar surroundings. I'm actually sitting in my office talking to you from my office today. So, trying to get into Seacrest more often if possible, and understanding, limitations of being able to come back and forth, and also, sticking to all the rules and regulations regarding staying at home and trying to isolate as best as possible. But it's good to be sitting in here today on my comfy little love seat and having an opportunity to see a lot of you. Let me just fix the contrast here. I look like I'm sitting in a dark room. There we go. I started on Tuesday talking about African American and Jewish relations because this has been a subject that has been fraught with a lot of good stuff and some not so good stuff. And the relationship between African Americans and Jews in the United States, really since the founding of this country and even before, has had what I would describe as probably a roller coaster type relationship, depending on at any given time, really what's going on with um, each individual ethnic group and in their own history, and how those histories have been able to, at some points in time, meld, and in other points of time have been more disparate. So I spoke on Tuesday about the history of African American and Jewish American interactions. We talked about the early 20th century and a period of time that was considered by some to be what they called the Golden Age, the age in which it seemed that Black-Jewish relations were quite good, that these two uh, ethnic groups, cultural groups, religious groups were seemed to be getting along and supporting one another because they had a common cause, and that cause was equality, and that cause was inclusion, and both were fighting for similar rights regarding housing, education, um, rights regarding uh, places where one could live, where one couldn't live, and so on, related to housing. But um, a lot of this support of one another culminated in the activism of so many American Jews from the northern and western states during the time of the civil rights movement in the late 50s through the early 60s. And there were many, many rabbis who were front and center in this attempt for voting rights, for equal rights for African Americans, and particularly uh, rabbis of more progressive movements, the Reform movement in particular, who came to the aid of Black causes. Rabbi Jacob Rothschild during this time was the rabbi of Atlanta's oldest and largest and most prominent Reform congregation called the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation, also known as the Temple. When you said the Temple, you knew exactly what people were talking about. And he had lived most of his life in Pittsburgh, so he was definitely a northerner. And he came in 1946. He came to the Temple in uh, Atlanta. And when he arrived there in 1946, by the way, he was there until 1973, so he served that congregation for quite some time. But he was very disturbed by the depth of the racial injustice that he was seeing, and he witnessed so many things that were extremely disturbing to him, and he resolved at that time to make civil rights a focal point of his rabbinate, of his rabbinical career. And he first broached the subject in his 1947 sermon on Rosh Hashanah, which was an incredibly brave thing to do because he had just come to the temple in 1946. And as any new rabbi in a congregation knows, you don't want to unsettle the waters. You want to make sure that, your sermons are very nice and lovely and provide information and comfort and that sort of thing. But he took this subject of black rights on right away, and but he was mindful of the fact that he was really still considered a Yankee and a Northerner, and that he was an outsider. So he, wanted to avoid alienating any of his supporters during his first years in Atlanta. But by the mid 50s, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which was the decision that called for the desegregation of public schools, um, race relations had become a recurring theme in his sermons, in his work at the temple, and members were accustomed to his support of civil rights. At the same time, he would reach out to members of the local Christian clergy. He became very active in civic affairs and active in the Atlanta Council on Human Relations and the Georgia Council on Human Relations. So Rabbi Jacob Rothschild was really a pioneer in this field of Jewish and Black relations during the early years of the civil rights movement. And um, while other rabbis were beginning to see the light, so to speak, and also get involved in this movement. And in 1957, there were cities, particularly in the South, that were erupting all over the United States because of this court-ordered school desegregation. And 80 ministers in Atlanta issued a statement calling for interracial negotiation and obedience to the law. And there was a peaceful resolution um, to the integration disputes, and it really kind of threatened Atlanta's more moderate reputation, because even though Atlanta was the South, it was also big city South. So the Minister's Manifesto, as this statement became known, was really a turning point in Atlanta's race relations. And there was some because it had been written by Christian ministers, there was some very strong Christian language in it that prevented Rabbi Rothschild from signing on to it himself. But he helped to conceive and draft the document, and he endorsed it separately in both the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution, which were the two large Atlanta newspapers at the time. In October of 1958, there was a catastrophe at the temple where 50 sticks of dynamite that had been planted exploded there, doing significant damage. And the concern was, of course, that Rabbi Rothschild's involvement in civil rights and his speaking out regularly in support of civil rights, particularly at public events, not just within his own synagogue, had led to this violence taking place at the temple in Atlanta. But he never withdrew from public life, and he actually stepped up his activism following the bombing. He spoke regularly in support of civil rights. He continued to serve on the Atlanta Council on Human Relations, in fact, as its vice president. And members of his congregation were very brave. They followed his lead. They took leadership positions in a lot of these human relations and other organizations. There was an organization called HOPE, Help Our Public Education, and two very influential organizations that helped bring about the peaceful integration of Atlanta's public schools in 1961. And Jews were very integrally involved in those organizations. During this entire period of time, Rabbi Rothschild forged a very close personal relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. And after King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, Rothschild actually helped to organize a city-sponsored banquet in King's honor, for which he actually also served as the master of ceremonies. And following King's assassination in 1968, the combined clergy of Atlanta held a memorial service at the Episcopal Cathedral of St. Philip to all pay their respects. And Rothschild, out of all the ministry in Atlanta, was selected by his peers to deliver the eulogy. In the years that followed, which speaks volumes about how he was revered and honored by the non-Jewish and the African American community. In the years after King's assassination, Rothschild became opposed to some of the more militant measures that were being adopted by the younger Black activists. And unfortunately, that cost him a considerable amount of the support that he had once enjoyed from the African American community in the civil rights movement. He had somewhat of a diminished standard and yet, or status, but notwithstanding that, Rothschild continued to speak regularly, continued to speak candidly about social justice and civil rights until he died. He had a heart attack on December 31st of 1973. And there have been recent studies that have shown that there's a greater trend for Southern Jews to speak out on civil rights issues, as shown by some of the marches that took place in the late 80s and so on. So part of this was considered to be the golden age from post-World War II up until the late 60s, considered to be the golden age of Jewish-Black relations. And we know, of course, about the famous, or maybe I should call it the infamous case of the Jewish supporters of Black voting rights who got involved in registering Blacks to vote, and the two young Jewish men who were murdered, Schwerner and, I knew I was going to forget this other young man's name. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, and a Black activist, James Chaney, who were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan near Philadelphia, Mississippi, as a result of their participation in the efforts to register Black voters. So now we see a bit of a change with the growth of the Black Power movement. And sadly, it was a change that impacted Jewish-Black relations, and has kind of impacted Jewish-Black relations for many years, up until relatively recently, where we see some glimmers of changes taking place. So I want to talk about those now for a moment after I get a sip of water.